Hi guys, my name is Stephanie and I am back with another DIY project. Today I'm going to be showing you the 7 easy steps to install picture frame trim on the walls in your home. And I don't have video of this, but before you get started with this project, I want you to remove all of the screws, the nails, the pictures, the curtains, everything from the room that you're going to be installing the picture frame trim in. Patch all of the holes with spackling. Sand the walls pretty smooth, so you want them to be looking nice. Then paint any of the walls that you're going to install the trim on at least one coat of the final color that you want the room to be. That just makes it easier to paint those walls with a roller before you get any of the trim up. Okay, now that step 1 is done, let's move on to step number 2, and that is planning the layout for your picture frame trim. I think for beginners, it's always easier to draw up a rough sketch of each wall that you're going to be installing the trim on. So I did that for my bedroom. I drew up the dimensions for where the doors were, how much distance were between certain points like the corners of a room and a door, so I knew how much area I had to work with. And that made it easier also as a guide for me to write down my measurements for my trim pieces for when I went out into the garage to cut them. I also knew before I got started that I wanted my sections of picture frame trim to be broken up into 2 boxes. A smaller box on the bottom and a larger box on top. Some people like to do one box per section, so from basically the floor to the ceiling in one box. Other people even like a 3-box system where you've got a really small box near the top, a bigger middle box, and then sort of a medium box on the bottom. Pick the layout you want. Look at some pictures online and decide what look you're going for before you start this project. I also knew when I was planning my layout that I liked the look of a 3.5-inch spacing between all of the boxes. And that makes it really easy for me to use a piece of 1x4 dimensional lumber that I always have in my garage from just doing all kinds of work around the house. So I could use 1x4 dimensional lumber as the spacing between my boxes. And if you know lumber, a 4-inch wide piece of lumber is actually about 3.5 inches. So that made perfect spacing between my boxes and also between the box and the baseboard and the box and the crown molding in my room. So I liked that look of spacing. I used 3.5 inches. You're looking at right there. You can also use that spacer to mark pencil lines to guide you when you're installing pieces of trim. So as I'm moving across a room, installing different boxes, I draw up guidelines for the next box that I'm going to install. It just makes installing by yourself so much easier when you know you have to meet a pencil line instead of trying to rely on just a level. I'll show you how I use that spacer later on in the video, but right now we're just talking about planning the layout. And I just want to point out that that 3.5-inch spacing between the baseboard and the boxes also accounted for where all of my outlets are in the room. So all of my outlets would fall inside the lower box. So that 3.5-inch spacing didn't put the trim running into any of my outlets. If you can avoid hitting outlets or switches or anything in the room with your design, that is the best solution. So you don't have to worry about raising boxes up, installing trim around boxes. So plan to avoid those things whenever possible. Another good rule of thumb when it comes to laying out your picture frame trim on the walls in your room is to make the box above doors the same width as the door. So make that one of the rules of thumb when you're drawing out your design. I don't care about the 3.5-inch spacing away from the corner of a wall. If the door is already up against the corner of the wall or just 2 inches away, I want to keep that box matching the door frame. It's going to look a lot better in the end. I have a few more tips for planning the layout for your picture frame trim, but first let's move on to step number 3, and that is cutting your molding. So I'm using 1.25-inch wide molding in this room. They sell in Lowe's all kinds of different molding that can be used for the picture frame trim. I like the kind where the center is where the highest point in the trim. Some people like the more traditional, like an actual picture frame molding where you've got the flat side on the outside of the boxes. Either one's fine. Just go with what you like. Again, look at pictures on Google to decide what type of trim is your favorite, what look you want to go for in your room. And I want to emphasize again that I am using the 1.25-inch wide molding. They usually have the exact same type of molding in a 3/4-inch option. On walls though, I always think the 1¼ inch wide trim looks a lot better. And as you can see here, I am using my miter saw to cut my molding. So that gives you nice, quick, clean cuts that you can line up perfectly with whatever marks you're making on your molding. So if you can use a miter saw, it is ideal. A miter box is going to make your work a lot harder and the edges are not going to be nice and clean. They also have new molding clippers that people talk about loving online. I've never tried those, but I'll put a link to one in the description below in case it's something you want to try if you want to try to do this project without buying a miter saw. But if you can get a miter saw and you're going to be doing projects like this in your home, baseboards, crown molding, other trim projects, a miter saw is going to be your best friend. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a secret that I always do when I'm installing trim in my house. I cut every piece of trim about 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch bigger than I think I needed it, because every once in a while my measurements are a little bit off. So I want to have a little bit too much material instead of a little bit less than what I needed. So in this case, I can hold that trim up exactly where I want to install it and make another pencil mark to say, okay, this is where for sure I really want this cut. So when you're working alone, you don't have somebody on the other end of a piece of trim holding it perfectly in place. This is just a way to avoid wasting material. So once I'm done making that final mark on the trim, I take it out to my miter saw and just shave off that little bit that I need to make it the perfect length for my picture frame trim. Okay, step number 4 is installing that newly cut piece of trim on your wall. And I am using my 18 gauge brad nailer to install my trim. I use it on all of the trim projects in my house, the crown molding videos that I've put up on my YouTube channel, all of the other trim projects that you've seen me do, building furniture and everything. My brad nailer is awesome. It's one of my favorite tools. In this part of the video right here, you can see that I'm about to shoot just one brad nail in on the right-hand side, and then I go all the way down to the left-hand corner and shoot another brad nail into that side. That is just my way of making sure that a long piece actually reaches both corners properly. Again, this is something I do when I'm working alone, and I don't want to put brad nails in all along that trim until I'm sure that the corners match up perfectly and I can use a level to make sure I keep that trim straight as I work across. Since that piece is so long, there is a lot of flex in the middle of that trim, so I got to make sure it stays straight as I'm working. And for this project, to get through that type of trim and get a pretty good grab into the drywall, I use at least a 1½ inch long brad nail with my brad nailer. You can go up to 2 inches and you'll be fine. I also try to shoot all of my brad nails in at a slight angle, and I alternate that angle up and down or left or right, whichever direction you're doing that in, so that your trim is held snugly against that drywall. And if any flex happens when you've got colder months, your nail just doesn't back out of the drywall. So you're shooting your nails in at an angle to hold that trim tightly against the wall. And if you make any mistakes when you're installing a piece of trim, don't be afraid to pull it off the wall. Remove all of the nails that are in the trim and in the wall and start again to get that looking perfect before you start doing any caulking or painting. So another trick when it comes to installing picture frame trim on walls is to make sure you're getting the nails in at least every 8 to 10 inches to also make sure it stays snugly held against the wall and you don't have any flex in that trim. I also sort of push on certain areas to make sure I don't see any movement after I've got the brad nails in. If I see any movement, if I can push against it and see it sort of move, the gap between the trim and the wall disappears, then I know I needed another brad nail there. Removing that flex and getting rid of that gap is going to be key to making sure that you don't get cracks in your caulk later on. Again, during weather changes, you'll see a lot of shifting and movement if you don't have that trim snugly against the wall. Okay, let's move on to step number 5, and that is filling the holes with spackling or wood filler. I like spackling because it is so easy to sand. Wood filler is just a little bit more effort to sand, so I go for the easy, especially when I'm doing a whole room project like this. As you're filling the holes, you can use a nail set and a hammer to sink any nails that are sticking out a little bit. So be sure to push the spackling into the nails so that you fill the whole hole with the spackling or the wood filler. And then I also like to slightly overfill each nail hole, so sort of build a hump over the nail with the spackling. That way you're sure that when you sand it, you can sand it flush and it's not going to shrink as it dries into the nail hole, leaving a little divot. After filling all of the nail holes, be sure to let that spackling dry according to the directions in the container, and then sand all of those nail holes smooth. I like to use this little Gator micro zip sander on trim because it has a nice flat side, but it's small enough to get into detail areas. So I can get a really flush looking nail hole that you can't even tell is there after I've put on 1 or 2 coats of paint. Once I finished all of the sanding and I've removed all of the dust from the trim, it is time to move on to caulking your trim. So you want to apply the caulking to both sides of the trim, and you want to have the tiniest amount of caulk come out of that gun as possible because you're not going to have that big of a gap between the trim and the wall. So you don't want to waste any caulk or spend a lot of time removing extra. So when you cut that caulk open, you want to have a tiny little cut. You're just going to put a thin bead right along that trim on both sides. As you're working, you need to remove it before it can dry. So I usually work in maybe 2 or 3 foot long runs. I run my finger along the caulking after I've applied it to push it into the gap. And then I use a damp washcloth or whatever scrap rag you have around the house to remove any excess caulking. After you've applied that first layer of caulking, let it dry completely before deciding if you need a second layer. The gaps that I had on this trim were so small that I didn't need a second layer of caulking. Sometimes if you have really uneven walls or if you're working with wood trim, which is a lot stiffer and doesn't flex against the wall like this MDF does, you might need a second layer of caulk. So just do the exact same thing again to make sure you've got the gaps filled in and you've got your trim work looking nice. Once you've finished all of your caulking and you've let it dry completely, you are ready to move on to step number 7, and that is painting, of course. And since I already painted 2 layers of white paint on this wall, I only needed to do touch up on the trim area. I was finished with the walls and only painting the trim at this point. I put 2 layers of paint on my trim work also. Be sure to follow the cure time recommended by the paint that you're using so that it dries completely and you don't have to worry about sticky paint or messing up the sheen on the paint if you're painting over tacky paint. And whenever you're painting trim that has lots of curves in it and lots of places for paint to build up, make sure that you're always looking back over the areas that you've just painted to catch any drips before they can dry. Okay, here is the finished room, and as promised, I have a few more tips for planning your layout. As you can see above the headboard, I only have 1 large box there. And that's because I thought breaking that into smaller areas wouldn't make sense above that headboard. So adjust things as you're working in the room where you know things are going to be. Make it make sense for your room. Between the 2 doors on this wall, I went with 3 boxes, 1 large in the middle and 2 smaller outside walls so that I could still have a nice large piece of art in the middle there. And the dresser is roughly the same size. But I didn't want the whole 9-foot stretch to be 1 wide box. That didn't make sense. So it needs to be 2 or 3. I thought 3 would look better. And as I mentioned before, I went with 3.5-inch gaps between the boxes, but I also accounted for my curtains. So I tried to keep the boxes a couple inches away from the edge of the curtains so that you could see the full box whenever possible, so that I just thought it looked nicer if you could see the full boxes instead of having part of the trim hidden behind a curtain. And I'll have a video coming out soon to show you how I installed that wall mural in between the trim in that 1 box in the center of that wall there. So if you're interested in seeing how easy it was to install that mural, make it look like a beautiful big piece of built-in art, subscribe to this channel and come back because I'll be sharing that video in the next few days. All right, guys, that is it for how to install picture frame molding on walls. I hope that helped you understand how to do it and feel confident in doing it yourself. Be sure to ask any questions you have in the comments below. I do try to answer things when I get a chance. All right, thanks.